They were terrified, not of an army, not of a weapon, of a people the Romans lived beside for 400 years, borrowed from, married into, buried among, and never quite understood. Picture yourself standing on a wooded ridge in central Italy, sometime in the last centuries before Rome grew teeth. You are wearing a dark, heavy cloak against the cold. The brim of your hat cuts the last of the sunset into a line across your eyes. You have a walking stick in one hand, and you have come a very long way to see this. Below you, the valley has almost filled with cloud now, and only the tops of things are showing. Through the mist, you can see two things burning. On the mountainside opposite, a fortified town in tiers, wooden houses stacked on stone terraces, torches in every doorway, and in the valley floor, just visible through a thin place in the cloud, a ring of standing stones, and inside the ring, more torches and shapes moving between them. You do not know what they are doing, and that, more than anything else, is what the Romans found unbearable. Their name, in the end, was the Etruscans. They lived in Tuscany, in Umbria, in the northern edge of Lazio, in cities Rome would one day swallow. And the strange thing, the thing this whole quiet night is really about, is that Rome did swallow them, and Rome kept borrowing from them for centuries afterward, and Rome still, at some level, did not quite know what it had eaten. So the question we are going to walk slowly around, for the next 2 hours or so, is this: who were the Etruscans, and what did the Romans see in them that they could never quite name? There is no rush at all. We are going to take the long way, through their tombs and their hilltops, and their iron furnaces, and their language and their sky, gently, one soft step at a time. You do not have to keep up. There is nothing to keep up with. The mist is not in a hurry either. If you have found your way here because you were looking for something quiet, something long, something with a voice that will keep going while the room goes dark, then that is exactly why I make these. If you would like more of them, you might consider subscribing, and if you feel like it, leave a comment and tell me where you are right now, and what time it is where you are. Somewhere else in the world, someone is reading yours at 3 in the morning, and finding the night a little less lonely for it. And now, gently. You do not have to keep watching the screen. You can put the phone face down, or set the laptop on the far side of the bed. You can close your eyes. The voice will keep going, softly, for a long time. It will still be here if you drift back. And if you do not, if you slip under in the next few minutes and do not surface until morning, that is not a failure. Sleep is the point. So, before we go any closer to that ridge, and before we go down into the valley with the stone circle and the torches, let us set the ground under our feet properly. Because whatever unease Rome carried toward these people, whatever quiet awe and quiet dependence, it grew out of a real landscape, and it is worth standing in that landscape for a moment before we go anywhere else. Picture a map of Italy. Find Tuscany, that soft hilly region north of Rome. Slide a little east into western Umbria. Slide a little south into the northern edge of Lazio. That whole territory, roughly, is what ancient writers called Etruria. Rolling country, cypress ridges, volcanic lakes held in old craters, valleys that fill with mist at dawn and turn to amber at dusk. Not a single kingdom, not an empire. A network of independent cities, each with its own walls and its own aristocracy and its own local gods. Tarquinia, on its windy plateau near the sea. Veii, close enough to Rome to trade insults across the Tiber. Cerveteri, Vulci, Volterra, Populonia looking out toward the island of Elba, and Perugia inland on its high ridge. Different cities, different rivalries, and yet all recognizably part of one culture. A shared language, a shared way of burying the dead, a shared patient way of reading the sky. That is where we are. Somewhere between the 8th century before the Common Era and the last quiet centuries before Rome absorbed the whole thing. A very long, unhurried story. I want to begin, gently, with the oldest argument about the Etruscans, which is the argument about where they came from in the first place. Because before we can talk about what they built, or what they believed, or why Rome watched them the way it did, there is this quieter question underneath. A question that people were already asking. 2,500 years ago, and could not agree on then either. Who were these people, really? Where did they walk in from? And the two oldest surviving answers, the two that everything else in the argument still leans against, come from two Greek historians writing 4 centuries apart. The first of them is Herodotus. If the word history has a founding figure in the Western tradition, it is him. He was writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, in the earliest generations of the discipline we now call history, gathering stories from travelers and traders and old men in harbor towns, weaving them together with a curiosity that was, for its time, almost unprecedented. He is the first surviving writer to try to tell us where the Etruscans came from. And his story is a strange, beautiful one. He says that a very long time ago, in a kingdom called Lydia, which lay in what is now the western part of Turkey, a terrible famine came upon the land. It went on and on. The people invented games, he says, to distract themselves from their hunger, playing dice on one day and eating on the next, trying to fool their bodies into forgetting. But the famine did not lift. And at last, the king made a decision. He divided his people into 2 groups by lot. One group would stay in Lydia with him. The other group, led by his own son, a prince named Tyrrhenus, would leave. They built ships. They loaded what they could. They sailed west across the Mediterranean, past islands and coastlines, until at last they came to the shore of central Italy, and there they settled. And, Herodotus tells us, they took the name of their prince. They became the Tyrrhenians. And the sea that lay against that coast, the sea that laps against Tuscany still, is called the Tyrrhenian Sea to this day. It is worth pausing for a moment on that name, because it is one of those quiet places where a very old story has left a fingerprint on a modern map. Whatever else you believe about the tale, the sea remembers, or at least Greek memory of the sea remembers, which is not quite the same thing. Now imagine Herodotus at his writing table. Ink-stained fingers. The Aegean somewhere over his shoulder. A traveller across from him, gesturing with cupped hands, describing a coastline his grandfather claimed to have seen. Telling him of a people in Italy who spoke oddly and buried richly, and read the sky in a way no Greek could quite follow. And Herodotus writing it all down, patient, curious, hedging where he must. Now move forward 400 years, to the age of Augustus, and meet the second historian. His name is Dionysius of Halicarnassus. He too is Greek, but he is living in Rome, working in the reign of the first emperor, at a time when the Etruscan cities were no longer independent players on the Italian stage, but were already deep inside the Roman world. Old, absorbed, familiar. And Dionysius, unlike Herodotus, could actually go and look, and he did. He walked among the Etruscans, or what remained of them as a distinct people. He compared their language to what was known of Lydian. He compared their customs, their religious rites, the shape of their gods. He read the older sources, including Herodotus, and at length, calmly in his patient, measured prose, he concluded that the Lydia story was not correct. The Etruscans, he wrote, were not migrants at all. They were indigenous to Italy. They had always been there. Their language, so far as he could tell, was unlike anything spoken in Lydia. Their gods were their own. Their ways were their own. They had grown up out of the Italian soil, as native as the cypress and the vine. Picture him at the close of one of those long working days, walking home through Rome, past temples that still used Etruscan ritual language for certain ancient prayers, past priests who could still, in the old way, read the will of the gods from the flight of birds or the shape of an organ, going quietly home to write a patient counter-argument to a story 400 years older than himself. So already, in antiquity, we have 2 Greek historians disagreeing. 2 intelligent, careful men, both trying to answer the same question, and arriving at almost opposite conclusions. The migration story and the indigenous story. And what is quietly striking is that neither of them ever went away. Both survived. Both were copied and recopied and read again and again across the centuries. And the argument between them, in one form or another, is still going on today. The modern picture, so far as archaeology and genetics can gesture toward it, leans toward Dionysius. The evidence, taken as a whole, seems to suggest that the Etruscans developed largely in place, growing out of the Iron Age cultures already living in central Italy, shaped by long conversation with the wider Mediterranean, but not descended, in any simple sense, from a boatload of Lydian refugees. Recent studies of ancient DNA from Etruscan sites appear to fit broadly with the populations already living in Italy in the centuries before Etruscan culture becomes visible. That is the current, tentative consensus. It is worth holding gently, because these things do shift. And yet the Lydia story never quite lets go. It still turns up in books. It still turns up in documentaries. It has a certain gravitational pull, and it is worth asking why. The answer is simple, I think. It is a beautiful story. A famine that will not lift. A king dividing his people by lot. A prince stepping onto a ship. Half a nation with him, looking back at a coastline they will not see again. Long weeks on the open sea, and then, one morning, a new coast rising in the west, pine ridges above quiet bays, and the wooden prows turning toward it. Stories like that do not die because the evidence turns against them. They live in a different room of the mind than the evidence does. So we may never know, with the kind of certainty a courtroom would demand, which of the two Greeks was closer to the truth. What the evidence seems to suggest, quietly, is that the truth is layered. That the people who became the Etruscans grew up in Italy, mostly, and yet were in constant conversation with the wider Mediterranean, with Greeks, with Phoenicians, with peoples further east along the trade routes that stitched the ancient sea together. That their culture was not a single arrival, but a long braiding. New threads coming in on every trading ship, older threads holding steady in the soil, which is, in fact, how most cultures happen. Slowly, from several directions at once. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would make a good ballad. Just centuries of small arrivals, small exchanges, small adjustments, until one day there is a people, and that people has a name. Whichever story is closer to the truth, though, both Herodotus and Dionysius agree on one quiet point, and it is the point I want to carry with us as we go on. By the time either of them was writing, the Etruscans were already old. Their cities were already old. Their tombs were already old. Their painted walls and their bronze mirrors and their patient sky-watching priests were already, from the Greek point of view, part of the deep past of Italy. Even Herodotus, in the 5th century before the Common Era, was reaching backward when he told his Lydian tale. He was trying to explain something that had already been in place for a very long time, which means that whatever unease Rome carried toward these people, whatever quiet awe crept into the Roman imagination when it thought about the ridges of Etruria and the smoke rising from Etruscan altars, we have not yet gone deep enough to find its roots. We have to go further back still. Back before there was a name for these people at all. Back into the smoke-blue centuries before either Greek historian was born. Before Rome itself was a village on 7 hills. Into the age of iron huts and cremation urns. And the first quiet stirrings of what would, in time, become Etruria. Before the Etruscans were called Etruscans, they were called nothing at all. Or nothing we can recover. No inscription names them in those early centuries. No neighbor writes them down. And yet we can see them, quite clearly, in the ground. We can see their villages, and their fields, and above all their cemeteries, waiting patiently to be given a name by people who would not arrive with the vocabulary to name them for another few hundred years. It is one of the gentler puzzles of the ancient world. A people fully present, fully at work, fully burying their dead with care, and still, in our records, anonymous. So let us walk toward them without a name in our mouths, and see what the earth remembers of them anyway. The archaeologists call them Villanovans, though the Villanovans themselves would not have recognized the word. It comes from a small place called Villanova, a hamlet near Bologna in northern Italy, where in the middle of the 19th century, a landowner named Giovanni Gozzardini began uncovering a strange, orderly cemetery on his own property. The graves he found were unlike anything then known in the region. Small pits, cremated bone, distinctive clay urns. And because the site at Villanova was the first of its kind to be studied carefully, the whole culture eventually took its name from that quiet field. That is how these things often go. A people wait in the ground for 3,000 years, and then take the name of the nearest railway stop. The Villanovan culture flourished in central and northern Italy, roughly through the 9th and 8th centuries before the Common Era. Its heartland is the same heartland we have already been walking through. The hills of what would later be called Etruria, the same slopes of Tuscany and western Umbria and northern Lazio, where generations on, painted cities and rock-cut tombs would rise. The landscape did not change. The people, in the deeper sense, did not change either. They simply grew, over time, into something we recognize by another word. Their villages were small, clusters of round or oval huts, with wattle and daub walls and thatched roofs, gathered on defensible hilltops, near springs, near workable soil. Their tools tell the story of a slow, patient turning of an age. Bronze still very much in use, still beautiful, still valued, but iron beginning to appear more and more often. Iron sickles, iron knives, iron fittings. A metal harder to work, requiring hotter fires and more skill, but stronger once mastered. This was the local face of the wider Iron Age creeping across the Mediterranean world. And their dead above all we know from their dead. The Villanovans practiced cremation as their dominant rite. The body was burned on a pyre, and the ashes gathered carefully and placed inside a very particular kind of clay vessel. 2 rounded bellies stacked one atop the other, narrowing to a waist in the middle, and rising to a single mouth at the top. Archaeologists call this shape biconical, which is a plain word for a rather graceful object. Over the mouth of the urn, they often set a lid, sometimes a simple inverted bowl, sometimes something more striking, a small clay helmet or a miniature bronze one, as if the ashes inside had been given a warrior's headgear for whatever came next. The urn was then lowered into a pit, sometimes ringed with stones, sometimes accompanied by a few small offerings, a brooch, a spindle whorl, a razor, a cup, and covered over. Row upon row of these pits, in cemeteries that stretched sometimes for hectares along the slopes below the living villages. Picture one of those cemeteries on a winter morning, a hillside above a small settlement in what is now Tuscany, mist lying low over the valley, the smoke of cooking fires rising from the huts below. The graves are not marked with grand monuments, just low stones perhaps, or nothing at all above the surface. Beneath each one, a small clay vessel holding the ashes of a person who was, in their lifetime, someone. A grandmother, a smith, a child who did not live long. All of them in their patient rows. And the world going on above them, wood being cut the same way it had been cut for centuries, sheep bleating on the next ridge, iron beginning, quietly, to change the shape of a plough. For a long time this world was largely inward-looking. Villages traded with villages. Metal moved along familiar paths. Then, across the 8th century before the Common Era, the pace of contact with the wider Mediterranean began to quicken. Greek colonists were founding new cities in southern Italy and Sicily, places like Cumae and Pittacusae on the Bay of Naples, where Greek and local and Eastern goods all mixed on the same beaches. Phoenician traders, sailing from the coasts of what is now Lebanon and from their western colonies, were threading their ships up the Italian shore, looking for metal, looking for markets. And the small Villanovan settlements of central Italy, sitting on rich ore deposits and good farmland, were suddenly on the map of a much wider world. You can watch it happen in the graves, slowly at first, then more quickly. A Greek-painted cup appears beside a local urn. An amulet of Egyptian faience, blue-green and glassy, turns up around the neck of a child. A bead of amber, carried down from the Baltic along old overland routes, is placed on a woman's breastbone. Foreign objects, still rare, still precious, beginning to gather in the burials of those who could afford them. And with the foreign objects come foreign ideas, new shapes for pottery, new motifs, new ways of showing wealth in death. Imagine a scene, likely, because the details are ours to guess at. A small harbor on the Tyrrhenian coast in the late 8th century. A Greek trading ship rides in on the afternoon swell, its sail furled, its oars slowing. Down through the pines from the settlement above walks a young man, the son of a local chieftain, sent to see what the strangers have brought. A crate is opened. A painted cup is lifted out and turned in the low light, its black figures catching the sun. He does not yet have a word for what he is holding. He only knows that he wants it, and that his father will want it, and that whatever it is, it belongs now, in some small way, to the hillside behind him, as well as to the sea. By the 7th century before the Common Era, this quiet exchange had bloomed into something the historians call the Orientalizing period, an ungainly word for a marvelous moment. Elite tombs from these decades are suddenly, almost startlingly rich. Gold jewelry worked in tiny granulations, so fine they can barely be seen with the naked eye. Ivory combs and plaques carved with lions and sphinxes and palm trees. Silver bowls with beaten scenes of hunts and processions. Motifs borrowed from Phoenician workshops, from the great courts of the Near East, from Egypt, all remade in the hands of Italian craftsmen, for Italian patrons, and laid down in Italian earth. Picture a tomb chamber, freshly closed in the middle of that century. Its occupant lies on a low bier, wrapped in a coverlet of thin gold foil that has been pressed and stamped with rows of small animals. Around the body are silver drinking bowls, ivory combs, painted pottery gathered from 3 different coasts. The door is sealed. The mourners walk back down the hill, and what has just been buried is not only a person, but a statement that this family and this town now belong to a larger world. Some scholars still debate exactly how much of this transformation came from within, from local Villanovan wealth and skill quietly accumulating over generations, and how much came from the Mediterranean networks pouring into central Italy in those centuries. The most likely answer, gently, is both. The Villanovans did not vanish and get replaced by newcomers. They grew and traded and absorbed and became. Somewhere in the long, slow braid of the 8th and 7th centuries, a coherent culture became visible in the ground. One we now call Etruscan. There was no ceremony. There was no year. There was only, at last, a people we can name. And once the tombs began to fill with objects like these, the tombs themselves began to change. They stopped being pits and started being rooms. Rooms with walls, rooms with ceilings, and, in some places, rooms with painted walls, where the dead were shown feasting and dancing in colors that have not yet, even now, entirely faded. I want to spend a long, slow time now on Tarquinia, because Tarquinia is where the Etruscans painted their dead. The town itself sits on the Tyrrhenian coast, north of Rome on a ridge above a river that runs down to the sea. In its living centuries, it was one of the 12 great cities of ancient Etruria, one of the members of that loose confederation which met and feasted, and worshipped together, and at moments went to war together. The living town has drifted a little over the millennia, moving from one ridge to another as populations shifted and fortifications changed. But its dead have not moved. They lie where they have always lain, in the long low ridge outside the walls, the Monterozzi necropolis, one of the most extraordinary funerary landscapes anywhere in Europe. From above, in the flat evening light, you can see the small round mounds of it stretching across the grass, each one covering a chamber cut into the rock below. The tombs themselves are carved down into the soft tuff, the pale volcanic stone that makes so much of central Italy workable by hand. You reach them by a narrow flight of stone steps that descends into the earth, and then a small doorway, and then a chamber inside. Sometimes there is only one room. Sometimes there are several, arranged like the rooms of a modest house, with a threshold and a lintel and a low bench cut along the wall. And in a small but astonishing number of these rooms, the walls and the ceilings and the little triangular pediments above the doors have been covered in paint. Not stone reliefs, not carved figures, painted scenes, in color, laid directly onto the plastered rock more than 2,500 years ago. Let me name some of them gently, because their names are half the pleasure. There is the tomb of the Augurs, from the late 6th century before the Common Era. Its walls hold figures in ceremonial dress, funerary games, a pair of wrestlers grappling for a set of bronze bowls stacked between them, and a strange masked figure, bearded, cloaked, whose meaning is still argued. Some read him as a ritual specialist officiating over the games. Others read him as a demon of the underworld who has come to claim what the games celebrate. He may be both. The Etruscans, as we shall see again and again, did not always feel the need to separate such things. There is the tomb of the triclinium from the 5th century, a room named for the 3 couches its painters showed inside. On its walls, banqueters recline on those couches in patterned robes, men and women together, holding shallow cups. Musicians walk beside them, one playing a double flute, one plucking a lyre. Dancers move between pairs of slender trees, their arms lifted, their fingers curled in gestures we do not entirely know how to read. The whole room feels less like a tomb than like a party that has been quietly held in place, waiting for someone to walk back in and pick up a cup. And there are others. The tomb of the leopards, its ceiling checkered in bright squares, 2 spotted cats staring down from the pediment above the feast. The tomb of hunting and fishing, where small dark birds burst up from the water, and a diver leaps from a painted cliff. The tomb of the bulls, older and stranger, with its scenes drawn from Greek myth, pressed up against images that are not Greek at all. Each tomb has its own atmosphere. Each holds its own quiet astonishment. The colors themselves are worth pausing on. Reds, made from iron oxide, warm and earthen and thick. Yellows drawn from ochre. Blacks laid down in soot. Whites from lime. And, most extraordinary of all, the blue-greens made from crushed and heated minerals. From copper compounds and imported pigments which have kept their brightness through more than 2,000 years in the dark. Above ground, sunlight would have faded them within a generation. Below ground, with the door sealed and the air still, they simply waited. When a lamp is brought back into one of these chambers, the colors come forward as if they had been holding their breath. The sheer scale of Monterozzi is also worth holding for a moment. There are thousands of tombs cut into that ridge. Thousands. Only a small fraction of them were ever painted. Only a smaller fraction of those have survived the slow work of moisture, the long carelessness of centuries, the collapse of ceilings and the crumbling of plaster, and at times, the deliberate hand of thieves and vandals. And yet what remains, gathered together, is enough. Enough to reconstruct, roughly, how these people wanted their afterlife to feel. Not grim, not silent, not empty. Painted and warm and full of company. What the scenes actually mean is still argued, of course, and gently. Some scholars read the banquets as literal funerary feasts, meals that were held above ground on the day of the burial, and then remembered in paint on the walls below. Others read them as depictions of the afterlife itself, an eternal, cheerful dinner held in a painted room deep in the rock, where the dead go on eating and drinking and listening to the flute forever. Others read them as idealized aristocratic life, the way this family wished to be seen, frozen and preserved for the dead to keep looking at. It is possible, again, that all 3 are partly true. The Etruscans do not seem to have needed to choose between literal and symbolic. They painted, and the painting did its work. Try, if you like, to imagine the descent. You have been standing on the ridge in the warm afternoon, with the grass bright and the sea a thin blue line off to the west. You step to the mouth of the stair. The steps are narrow, worn smooth, sinking quickly into shadow. 6 steps, 8, 10. At the bottom is a small door cut squarely into the rock. You pause. Someone raises a lamp beside you. And then, for a second, the room opens. The banqueters lift their cups in the flickering light. The flute player leans forward. The dancers seem, in the wavering of the flame, to still be moving between their painted trees. It is not hard to understand what the 19th century archaeologists felt when they first came down through cracks in the rock, lowering candles on strings, glimpsing color below and knowing, even before they could see clearly, that whatever waited beneath them was intact. They wrote about it afterwards in careful, measured prose, but the letters and journals still shine a little at the edges. They knew, in the moment the candle steadied, that they were looking at something no living eye had seen in 2,000 years, and that it had been kept for them by nothing more than the dark. There is something in that thought worth holding softly. The paintings did not survive because anyone protected them. No guard was posted, no shrine was maintained. They survived because the door was closed, and the hill was quiet, and the rock was patient, and time, for once, simply passed over them without doing its usual work. In a world where so much of what the Etruscans made was carried off, or melted down, or ploughed under, or built on top of, these small rooms of paint stayed, not because they were hidden well, because they were left alone. And so, when we speak of Tarquinia, we are speaking of a place where the afterlife was imagined as a room with a ceiling, a room with a doorway, a room where the meal never ended, where the musicians never quite stopped playing, where the dancers went on turning between their trees in colors that would not fade. It is a gentle vision, taken together, not triumphant, not fearful, domestic, almost, as though death were a house you moved into, rather than a country you were sent to. But Tarquinia was not the only place the Etruscans built rooms for their dead. Down the coast, at Cerveteri, they went further. They built whole cities of them. Cerveteri is the strangest, and in some ways the softest, of the Etruscan places. Because at Cerveteri, the dead were given a town of their own, not a graveyard on the edge of the living settlement, not a field of markers behind a wall, a town, with streets and blocks and squares and neighborhoods and houses of stone that mirrored the houses of wood and mud brick where the living slept. The ancient name of the place was Caere, and it sat on a plateau of soft, tough rock a few miles inland from the sea, northwest of Rome. In its wealthiest centuries, in the 7th and 6th before the Common Era, it was among the greatest of the Etruscan cities. A trading power looking out across the Tyrrhenian to Greece and Carthage, wealthy enough that its aristocracy could afford to build not one afterlife, but many. The cemetery is called the Banditaccia. Today it is a protected landscape, listed by UNESCO alongside the necropolis at Tarquinia, and if you go there in the low light of an afternoon, what you see is not what most cemeteries look like at all. You see a field of low green domes rising softly out of the plateau, some small and modest, some enormous. From above, they look like a field of round hills that someone has smoothed by hand. From the paths between them, they look like a suburb of round stone houses that have simply grown grass on their roofs and settled in for the long quiet. These are the tumuli, great earthen mounds, sometimes 20 meters across, sometimes 30, raised over chambers cut down into the soft tuff below, and they are laid out along streets. That is the detail that stops you when you first understand it. There are streets in the necropolis, not the accidental paths worn between graves, but actual planned ways, aligned, corners squared, the kind of grid you might find in a living town. Along those streets, the tomb mounds sit in ordered blocks. Some scholars have counted what look like neighborhoods, districts belonging to particular families, whole small quarters of the dead arranged the way the living arrange themselves at supper. It is a planned landscape. Someone drew this. Someone thought about where the roads should run, and where the great houses of the great families should stand, and whether the smaller tombs should cluster around them the way lesser households cluster around a lord. The interiors carry the same idea further. You step down through a doorway cut squarely into the tuff, and you find yourself not in a pit or a niche, but in a corridor, and the corridor leads you into rooms. A central hall, side chambers opening off it. Stone benches along the walls of the side chambers, benches shaped and sized for a body to lie on, sometimes carved with pillows of stone, sometimes with the outline of a headrest. And above you, ceilings carved to look like wooden beams, roof timbers in rock. The chambers imitate, in every detail they can, the interior of a wealthy Etruscan house. It is as though the mason has been told, gently and firmly, to build the same living room the family used above ground, only this time to build it in stone and to build it to last. In one of the most famous of these, the Tomb of the Reliefs, dated to the 4th century before the Common Era, the imitation goes further still. The walls are covered in low-relief carvings, painted in bright colors when they were new, and the carvings show hundreds of small everyday objects. Helmets hang on painted pegs, swords lean against painted walls, ropes coil neatly, a knife, a jug, a ladle, a cooking pot, a folded cloth, a leash for a dog. It is a household inventory in stone, the whole comfortable furniture of a life set down in permanent form, so that the dead might have around them, forever, exactly what they had around them in their kitchens and their halls. A house preserved not by keeping it, but by carving it. And then, in 1836, at Cerveteri, two men opened a chamber that had been sealed since the 7th century before the Common Era. Their names were Alessandro Regalini, a local priest, and Vincenzo Galassi, a general. And the tomb they entered is still called by both of them together the Regalini Galassi. What they found inside was one of the richest single Etruscan burials ever recovered. There was a great gold pectoral, an ornamental chess piece, covered in tiny embossed figures, pressed into the metal in row after row of astonishing fineness. There were fibulae, brooches, worked with granulation so delicate that later goldsmiths would spend generations trying to reproduce the technique. There were silver vessels. There were bronze cauldrons. There was a decorated bronze bed on which a body had been laid. Most of what they lifted out is now held in the Vatican museums, in rooms of their own, and even in the electric light of a modern gallery. Behind glass, the gold still does something to the air of the room. Try, for a moment, to imagine the moment they entered. Two men in the early years of Italian archaeology, standing at the mouth of an unopened chamber, with a candle held between them. The air inside is old and dry and untouched, and at the far end of the room, at the very edge of the candle's reach, there is a glint. Just a glint, a line of yellow catching the flame. And then another. And then the slow understanding, as the light steadies, that the whole far wall is furnished, that nothing has been taken. That whatever was set down here nearly 2,500 years earlier is still in the exact posture in which it was left, waiting. Why did the Etruscans do this? Why did they build cities of the dead that looked so much like cities of the living? The gentle answer, the one the tombs themselves seem to whisper, if you sit long enough in one of them, is that the boundary between the two was thinner for them than it is for us. Death was not exile. It was not a going out into a wilderness. It was a move down the street, into a house you had prepared in advance, in a neighborhood where your family had prepared theirs. Some scholars go further, and read the whole Banditaccia as a mirror city, in which the social life of Caeri simply continued below ground. The same families in the same quarters, the same great houses at the important corners, the same seating at dinner, only now the dinner did not end. We cannot be certain that this is what they meant, but the architecture keeps making the argument, quietly, for anyone who walks through it. Stand on one of the larger tumuli at Banditaccia toward dusk, and something odd happens. The shadows of the other mounds lengthen across the grass, and then begin to touch, and then begin to merge, until the whole necropolis reads as one soft, undulating landscape of low-breathing hills. The individual tombs stop being individual. They become a single quiet country. And it is possible, standing there, to feel that the Etruscans understood something about the dead that we have largely forgotten. Not that they were fearsome, not that they were far away, but that they were near and settled, and living in houses very like our own, only a few feet lower, and a little quieter, and with the door pulled closed. Step down, in imagination, into the tomb of the reliefs one more time. See the little painted helmets on their painted pegs. See the ropes coiled neatly. See the knives waiting on their painted shelves. Everything hung and set in its place, as though the household had gone out for the evening and might, at any moment, come home. Now all of this gold, and all of this bronze, and all of these carefully hammered fibulae, and pectorals, and cauldrons and beds, had to come from somewhere. The Etruscans did not find gold and iron and copper lying in their fields. They mined it, and they smelted it, and they shipped it, and along a particular stretch of the Tyrrhenian coast, they built an industry so large that the smoke of their furnaces hung over the sea for centuries. Which brings us, gently, to that coast, and to the furnaces. The reason the Etruscans could fill their tombs with so much bronze and so much iron, with so many mirrors and cauldrons and delicate hammered leaves of gold, is very simple, and it is geological. They lived on top of one of the richest metal-bearing regions in the ancient Mediterranean. The land itself was generous to them, in a way it was generous to almost no one else on the Italian peninsula. Copper in the hills, iron on the island just off the coast, tin and lead and silver in the same low ranges. And the Etruscans, patiently and cleverly, and over many generations, learned to gather all of it, and to smelt it, and to work it, and to send it out into the world in the holds of small dark ships. The center of this metal world was a city called Populonia. Populonia is unusual among the Etruscan cities, because almost all of the others stood inland, on defensible hills, looking down at their valleys and their fields. Populonia did not. Populonia was built directly on the sea, on a promontory in what is now northern Tuscany, its walls curving above the water and its harbors folded into the coast below. It was, in a sense, the one Etruscan city that had decided to face outward, not toward the safety of the interior, toward the horizon, toward the boats coming in with their heavy, awkward loads, low in the water, from the island across the strait. That island is Elba. Today it is best known for a much later exile and a much later emperor, but long before Napoleon ever saw it, Elba was one of the great iron sources of the western Mediterranean. Its mountains were streaked with hematite, the ore reddish and heavy in the hand. Etruscan miners cut into those slopes, and Etruscan crews loaded the ore into small vessels, and those vessels crossed the narrow strait to Populonia, where the real work began. There is something almost tidal about it. Ore out of the mountain, ore across the water, ore onto the beach, ore into the fire, iron out of the fire, and then the ships going out again, this time to distant harbors, with the finished goods stowed carefully in the hold. Behind Populonia, inland, ran the Colline Metallifere, the metal-bearing hills of southern Tuscany. They gave up copper and tin and lead and silver in quantities that made the whole Etruscan bronze industry possible. Bronze, remember, is not a single metal. It is a marriage of copper and tin. And to make bronze at scale you need both, and you need them nearby, and you need people who understand how to combine them. The Etruscans had all three, and they had them for centuries. The industrial reality of Populonia is one of the strangest and most quietly moving things in the archaeology of Italy. The city was so busy at ironworking for so long that its own waste over the generations began to bury it. Slag from the furnaces, the dark, glassy residue of ore reduced to metal, was piled and dumped along the shoreline until the heaps became small hills of their own. When archaeologists eventually came to work at Populonia in modern times, they had to move the slag before they could reach the classical layers beneath. The city had, in a sense, been swallowed by the byproduct of its own success. Whole beaches of black glassy stone, centuries of firelight compressed into rubble. The process itself, if we walk through it slowly and without technical clutter, was this. Raw ore arrived by boat and was broken and sorted on the shore. It was then roasted in bloomery furnaces, small structures built of clay and stone, tall enough to stand at chest height, and packed with charcoal and ore in careful layers. Bellows were worked steadily by hand, pushing air into the base of the furnace, raising the heat until the ore began to give up its iron. What emerged, when the furnace was broken open, was not a clean bar of metal, but a rough glowing lump, called a bloom, streaked with slag and impurities. That bloom was then hammered and folded and hammered again, until the iron inside was drawn out clean and could be shaped into tools and weapons and the fittings of ordinary life. The results traveled. Etruscan iron and Etruscan bronze moved the length of the Mediterranean, into Greek harbors, into Phoenician colonies, into the trading posts of the far western coasts. Etruscan bronze mirrors have been found in a wide range of ancient sites, their reverse sides delicately engraved with scenes from myth, gods and heroes drawn in fine incised lines, the faces slightly stylized, the hair curling. Hold one of these mirrors in imagination for a moment. The front polished to a soft golden sheen, meant to catch a woman's face at her toilet. The back, a small crowded artwork, a private gallery held in the hand. The craftsmanship is genuinely, unshowily impressive. And this is where a word from our title deserves a gentle honoring. The Etruscans were, in the ordinary historical sense of the word, advanced. Not in any science fiction sense, not in the sense of secret technologies or lost sciences. In the sense of a culture that was extraordinarily skilled with its hands, extraordinarily well organized in its workshops, and extraordinarily well connected across the sea. They knew what they were doing with fire and metal. They knew what they were doing with the pattern on the back of a mirror. They knew what they were doing with the roots of a trading ship. It is possible that some of what later Romans read as strangeness was simply this competence, seen from a distance, by a younger city that had not yet caught up. There is a quiet suggestion in some of the ancient sources that Etruscan metallurgical skill was one of the things the Romans watched most closely and most enviously. Whether the Romans truly feared Etruscan weapons in the field, or simply wanted Etruscan iron and Etruscan technique in their own forges, is difficult to say. What we can say, and what the record makes plain, is that once Rome absorbed Etruria, Rome inherited the mines, and Rome kept using them. The furnaces along the coast did not go out. They only changed hands. Picture, for a moment, a Populonian evening in the 5th century before the Common Era. The sea flat and pink in the low sun. The shore black with slag, glinting faintly where the light catches a piece of glassy waste. Along the beach, the red mouths of the bloomery furnaces flicker under a low, drifting pall of wood smoke, and figures move around them, small against the fires, feeding charcoal, working bellows, drawing out the glowing blooms with long tongs. The sound is a steady breathing, the bellows going in and out, and the occasional dull ring of a hammer somewhere behind, in one of the yards. Across the water, Elba stands dark against a bruised sky, its mountains folded into layers of shadow, and small boats move low across the strait, loaded with the next day's ore. Inland, in a town such as Volterra or Vulci, the same evening finds a blacksmith's yard closing down for the night. A bronze mirror has just been lifted from its mold, still warm, its disc heavier than it looks, the engraved back not yet cut. A young apprentice waits at the edge of the bench, with a fine burin in his hand, ready for tomorrow's work, when the master will decide which scene from the old stories should be laid into the metal, and where the borders should curl, and how the small figures should meet each other across the polished surface. All of this, the fire and the ore, and the ships and the engraved mirrors, was a single, continuous economy. And it made the Etruscans, for a long stretch of centuries, one of the wealthiest and most technically capable peoples of the Mediterranean. The tombs we walked through in the last chapter, with their painted helmets on painted pegs, were only the visible end of that long chain of skill. The gold came from somewhere. The bronze came from somewhere. The iron came from somewhere. It came from here, from these black beaches, from that dark island, from those quiet hills. But the Etruscans did not only work in metal, they worked in signs. They read the world for signs the way a smith reads iron in a fire, patiently, expertly, and with an authority that other peoples came to trust. And of all the signs they read, the strangest, and the one the Romans borrowed most nervously, was written on the body of a sheep. I want to introduce you, gently, to a small bronze object about the size of a man's cupped palm. It sits now in a museum in northern Italy, under a pane of clean glass, quiet as a stone, and it has been quiet for over 2,000 years. It is not beautiful in the way a painted tomb is beautiful, or a gold fibula, or a bronze mirror engraved with the meeting of gods. It is a working thing, a specialist's tool, and yet in its small compartments and careful inscriptions, it holds one of the strangest inheritances the Romans ever accepted from the people they eventually conquered. The object is called the bronze liver of Piacenza. It was cast, most scholars believe, in the late 2nd century before the Common Era, or perhaps the very early 1st, in the last generations before the old Etruscan world was fully folded into Rome. It was found in 1877, turned up by a plough in a field near the town of Piacenza, in northern Italy, in what had once been the northernmost reach of Etruscan influence. Today it rests in the civic museums of Palazzo Farnese, in that same town, cared for, catalogued, studied, and still not entirely understood. It is, quite literally, a model of a sheep's liver, roughly 10 centimeters across at its widest point, cast solid in bronze, heavier in the hand than you would expect for something so small. Its upper surface is not smooth. It is divided by low raised ridges into a network of small compartments, some rectangular, some irregular, some barely more than a nick between two lines. And in each of those compartments, a name has been inscribed. Most of them are the names of gods. The script is Etruscan, that half-familiar alphabet that looks almost like Greek and is not, and reads from right to left in tidy, close-set letters. The pattern is what unsettles the modern eye. The outer edge of the liver, the rim, is divided into 16 segments. 16, and Etruscan religious writers, quoted by later Roman authors, tell us that the sky itself, the visible dome of the heavens, was divided by the Etruscans into 16 regions, or houses, each belonging to a particular god or class of gods. So the little bronze object in your imagined palm is not merely a model of an organ, it is a map. On one side of the map is the body of a sacrificed animal. On the other side, in perfect correspondence, is the sky. Inside the outer ring of 16, further compartments hold further names, further deities, further regions of the cosmos, folded inward, layered like nested rooms. The specialists who used such a model, or rather the mental version of it that lay behind such a model, were called haruspices. They were the Etruscan ritual readers, the priests whose particular expertise was the interpretation of omens, and above all, the reading of the livers of sacrificed animals. A trained haruspix would take a sheep, killed at an altar with the proper words spoken, and would examine its liver with the calm attention of a scholar reading a page. He would note any peculiarity, a discoloration here, on the lobe that corresponded to a certain quarter of the sky, a swelling there, in the compartment of a particular god, a small mark, a scar, an unusual shape, a missing piece, and he would read those signs against the map he carried in his mind, and translate them into a message. This god is displeased. That quarter of the heavens is favorable. The undertaking should be delayed. The undertaking may proceed. The Romans, for all their reputation for cold practicality, could not read the sky in this way. They had their own augurs, who watched the flight of birds, and their own priests, who kept their own books. But the deep, detailed art of reading the liver, the art that treated the body of an animal as a small mirror of the heavens, was Etruscan, and remained Etruscan. And so throughout the Roman Republic, and well into the Empire, Rome employed Etruscan haruspices at the highest levels of state. Consuls consulted them. Generals consulted them. The Senate itself, in moments of crisis, sent north into Etruria for someone who knew. Cicero, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, discusses the haruspices at length. Sometimes he speaks of them admiringly, as men of ancient knowledge whose art deserves respect. Sometimes he speaks skeptically, with the raised eyebrow of the educated Roman gentleman who is not sure he believes any of it. But he always speaks of them as a real and powerful presence in the public life of the city. Their college in Rome, the Ordo Lex Haruspicum, the Order of 60 Haruspices, was maintained for centuries, an institution of the state, a body of specialists in a foreign science that Rome had never quite mastered on its own. This, I think, is one of the strongest of all historical anchors beneath the word in this story's title. That word terrified, that provocation we began with. Because the terror, if we can call it that, was not military. It was ritual. It was the quiet, uneasy knowledge that when the sky spoke, the Romans could not, on their own, entirely understand it. Something in the world would go wrong. A lightning strike would split a temple roof. A calf would be born with 2 heads. A statue would sweat, or a shield would fall, or a fire would break out where no fire had been laid. And Rome, for all its legions and its laws, would send a rider north into the old Etruscan hills to fetch someone else's expert. We do not know in full detail how those readings actually worked. We do not know the exact meaning of every name on the bronze liver of Piacenza. Some of the deities inscribed on it are familiar from other sources, and some are known only from that small green patinated surface, and nowhere else. We do not know the training that went into becoming a haruspix, or how the knowledge was passed from teacher to student, or how much of it was written into books that have since crumbled to dust. What we know is that the system was internally coherent, that its practitioners were respected across centuries, and that the Romans who prided themselves on the practical over the mystical could not quite let it go. Picture for a moment a late Etruscan sanctuary at dusk. An altar of pale stone, its top darkened by long use. A shallow bronze basin set nearby. A small sheep held quietly between two attendants, its head turned slightly to one side, unaware. And a haruspex in an embroidered mantle waiting a little apart, his hands folded, his face composed, the map of the sky already turning slowly in his head. The lamp lit, the evening breeze moving in the cypresses beyond the wall. The whole apparatus of a science that treated the world as a text. And now picture the object itself, as it is now. The bronze liver of Piacenza under museum glass in the north of Italy. A small, heavy weight of green patinated metal, its raised ridges casting tiny shadows under the display lamps. The inscriptions almost too fine to read without leaning close. A script that looks almost Greek, and is not. A tool whose full instructions have been lost, and whose surface still holds the whole shape of a lost cosmology. Quiet as a stone. And now one more picture. A meeting of the Roman Senate in a difficult year. Reports coming in. A lightning strike on a temple on the Aventine. A two-headed calf born on a farm outside the city. A statue turned, they say, on its base. A messenger sent north into Etruria on a good horse. A haruspex called down from one of the old cities, arriving perhaps some days later, tired from the road, calm in bearing, welcomed with an anxious formality. And the senators, in their togas waiting patiently, uneasily, for another people's system to tell them what their own gods were trying to say. This dependence went very deep. Deeper, in fact, than a matter of specialists called in for emergencies. It went into the very foundations of the city. Because for a long stretch of Rome's own remembered past, before consuls, before the Republic, when Rome was still only a rough town of hills and huts beside a bend in the Tiber, the kings who ruled it were, by Rome's own tradition, Etruscan. Rome, for most of its history, insisted very loudly that it was a republic. It made a founding story out of the day it stopped being ruled by kings, and it kept the memory of that day polished, like a coin passed hand to hand across generations. But if you look closely at those kings, and Rome remembered 7 of them in the traditional list preserved above all by the historian Livy, several of them are Etruscan, not distantly, not vaguely, but by name, by city of origin, by the shape of the works they left behind. The city that would one day fold Etruria into itself had first, for a long generation of its earliest life, been folded at least in part into the Etruscan world. The list, as Roman tradition set it down, begins with Romulus and runs through Numa Pompilius, Tullus Hostilius, and Ancus Marcius, 4 kings assigned to the older Latin and Sabine layers of the city. Then, in the 5th position, the tone of the list quietly changes. The next 3 kings, the last 3 before the Republic, are the ones around whom the Etruscan presence gathers. And it is worth walking slowly through their names, because those names carry more of the story than any single monument does. The 5th king in the traditional sequence was Lucius Tarquinius Priscus. Even his name is a signpost. Tarquinius of Tarquinii, that same Etruscan city on its ridge above the coastal plain, whose painted tombs we have already stood inside. In the tradition preserved by Livy and others, his father was a Greek exile who had settled in Etruria and married into an Etruscan family, and it was from Tarquini that Priscus, dissatisfied with the ceiling on his ambitions there, moved south to the rough young town beside the Tiber. He rose in Rome, he was noticed, favored, and eventually elected king. And the works credited to him in Roman memory are the works of a man reshaping a settlement into a city. The first laying out of the Circus Maximus, in the low valley between the Palatine and the Aventine. The draining of the marshy ground of the Forum, the beginnings of the great temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, that vast platform of stone that would dominate Roman religious life for 1,000 years. After him came Servius Tullius, the 6th king, whose origins are more tangled and more contested. In some strands of the tradition he is Latin, in others he is given Etruscan connections, and in an Etruscan version preserved centuries later, he appears under the name Mastana, a warlord of complicated loyalties. What Rome remembered of him, though, was mostly benign. A long reign, constitutional reforms that reorganized the citizen body into classes. The building, or at least the beginning, of the earthen and stone defenses, later known as the Servian Wall. In the Roman imagination, Servius was the good king in the middle, framed on either side by more troubling figures. And then the seventh, the last, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquinius again, Tarquin the Proud. In Roman tradition he is remembered as arrogant, high-handed, contemptuous of the Senate, willing to rule by fear where his predecessors had ruled by counsel. He was, the story says, finally expelled from the city in a general rising, and the traditional date given for that expulsion, 509 before the Common Era, was set down in Roman memory as the birthday of the Republic. The very identity of Rome as a state that did not have kings was defined against him. So the pattern, when you step back from it, is quiet and striking. The fifth and seventh kings of Rome, and possibly the sixth as well, carried Etruscan names or Etruscan associations, and the works ascribed to them, the first great works of monumental Rome, are precisely the kinds of works that Etruscan cities of the same period were already building for themselves. The temple on the height, the drained low ground, the processional space for games and public life, the first serious architecture of a city that intended to last. Nowhere is this inheritance more literally underfoot than in the Cloaca Maxima, the great drainage sewer of ancient Rome. It ran from the low ground between the hills down to the Tiber, carrying off the standing water and the runoff that had once turned the future Forum into a marsh. In Roman memory it was begun in the age of the kings, and specifically associated with Priscus and with Superbus. Later ages vaulted it in stone, and portions of it remarkably are still functional beneath the modern city. How much of what survives is truly of the regal period, of the 6th century before the Common Era, and how much is the work of later Roman rebuilding across many centuries, is genuinely uncertain. Archaeologists have argued the question for a long time, and have not fully settled it. What is not in doubt is that the memory of the work belonged, in Roman minds, to their Etruscan-named kings, and that, when you take it in, is a remarkable admission. The city that would eventually swallow the Etruscans had itself, in its own telling, been shaped in its infancy by them. The great sewer under the streets, the temple crowning the capital, the first monumental building program, the first drained and paved public spaces, the first grand ceremonial architecture, all of it done in Rome's own memory, under kings who wore Etruscan names. Just how Etruscan these kings really were, ethnically, politically, in the language they spoke at home, is difficult to say. Roman tradition was written centuries after the events it described, by writers with their own reasons to emphasize or to downplay foreign influence. Some modern scholars read the Tarquin dynasty as a period of genuine Etruscan overlordship in Rome, a stretch when the city was, in effect, a southern outpost of the Etruscan cultural world. Others read the whole tradition as a later rhetorical fiction, a way for Roman historians to explain, at a comfortable distance in time, why so much of their early culture, their rituals, their architecture, their public engineering looked so unmistakably Etruscan. It is very possible that both readings are partly right. Rome at its beginning was a mixed city, drawing Latin, Sabine and Etruscan strands together into something new. And one of the strands in that mix was Etruscan, sometimes light, sometimes heavy, but present. Picture, for a quiet moment, the low ground of the Forum before the Cloaca was built. Reeds standing in shallow water, a slow-moving stream winding down toward the river, frogs in the evenings, and engineers in Etruscan cloaks walking through the reeds with wooden stakes, measuring gradients, marking lines where a channel might be cut, speaking to one another in a language most of the townspeople around them did not fully understand. Picture 2. The tradition of Tarquinius Priscus arriving in Rome for the first time. He is in a cart with his wife Tanaquil, who in the Roman story is herself of Etruscan birth, and who is famed for her knowledge of signs. As they approach the city, an eagle drops out of the sky, lifts the cap from his head, circles, and sets it back gently upon him. Tanaquil watches the whole thing calmly, and she says to her husband, in the story, that this is a sign that the sky itself has crowned him. It is a small scene, half legend, half memory, and it captures something true about the atmosphere of that early city, in which an Etruscan woman reading an omen in the air was as much a part of arriving in Rome as the sight of its hills. And picture, finally, the last king on the last night, Tarquinius Superbus, riding out of a city that has finally had enough of him. The gates closing behind him in the dark, the lamps of Rome burning small and scattered on the 7 hills. And Rome, exhausted, angry and quietly transformed, deciding somewhere in the small hours that it will never again call any man king. The gates stayed closed. The name of king became in Rome a kind of curse. And once Rome had done with kings, it turned its attention outward, across the low hills and the river valleys to the north. And the first great city it went after, patiently, stubbornly across the span of a long war, was an Etruscan one. There is a long story in the 4th century Roman tradition about the siege of a city called Veii. It is one of those stories the Romans loved to tell about themselves, half history and half parable, and it sits at the hinge where the age of Etruscan power began to give way, quietly and unevenly, to the age of Rome. To understand it, you only need to picture the geography for a moment. Veii stood on a broad plateau of tufa stone, ringed by ravines only about 16 kilometers north of the Roman Forum. From the higher hills of Rome, on a clear day, you could look out across the low country and see the smoke of Veii's hearths rising in the distance. And from Veii, in turn, you could see Rome, 2 cities in sight of each other, watching one another grow. They had been watching for a long time. For generations, Rome and Veii had been rivals. They quarreled over the crossings of the Tiber, over the salt beds near the river mouth, over grazing land in the hills between them. There were skirmishes, truces, broken truces, and long, uneasy pauses. It was the sort of neighborly rivalry that shaped both cities more than either would have admitted. Each learning from the other, each hardening against the other, each unable to imagine the world without the other in it. In the traditional Roman date, in the year 396 before the Common Era, that long balance finally tipped. After a siege that Livy and later writers stretched out to a symbolic length of 10 years, echoing the 10 years of Troy, Veii fell. The commander in the Roman story is Marcus Furius Camillus, who is remembered afterwards as a kind of second founder of Rome, austere, pious and stern. And the story of how the city was taken is not really a military story at all. It is a ritual one. The Romans, so the tradition runs, could not break the walls by direct assault. The walls of Veii were high and well built, set above the ravines, and every attempt to climb them or batter them had failed. So they began patiently to dig. A tunnel was cut from the Roman siege lines, down through the soft tufa, and driven slowly toward the heart of the city. And the tunnel, in the story, was aimed with strange precision. It came up inside the citadel of Veii, directly beneath a temple where the Etruscan king was in the middle of a sacrifice. Above ground, in that temple, a haruspex was reading the entrails of the offered animal, and he said in the story that whoever completed this sacrifice would be granted the victory in the war. A Roman soldier, hidden just below the floor with the earth still warm from digging, heard the words. Word passed back through the tunnel, and in the next moment the Romans burst up through the ground, seized the offering, completed the ritual themselves, and took the city while its defenders were still turning toward the sound. It is a beautiful story, and it should be held gently. The tunnel detail almost certainly belongs to legend more than to engineering. The neat overhearing of the omen belongs to a Roman literary imagination that loved to show Rome winning by piety as much as by arms. But the underlying event, the fall of Veii to Rome around this date, is not in serious doubt. A great Etruscan city, one of the 12 that made up the loose league of Etruria, passed out of Etruscan hands and into Roman ones. Its territory was divided. Its people were absorbed. Its name slowly faded from the map of independent places and became simply another Roman town. And what happened to Veii over the next 3 centuries happened to Etruria as a whole. It happened slowly. It happened unevenly. It happened city by city and decade by decade, sometimes by war, sometimes by treaty, sometimes by the quiet arithmetic of intermarriage and shared coinage and shared roads. Some Etruscan cities allied with Rome and kept much of their local life for a long time. Some resisted, were besieged, and were broken. Some simply drifted into Rome's orbit, as the trade routes shifted and the currencies changed, and the young men began more and more to serve in Roman armies rather than their own. From the 4th century into the 3rd, and from the 3rd into the 2nd, the pressure was steady, and the direction was always the same. By the 1st century before the Common Era, Etruria was, in every practical sense, Roman territory. Etruscan aristocratic families were sitting in the Roman Senate. Their sons carried Roman names and Roman offices. Their old cities were being remodeled with Roman fora, Roman baths, and Roman street grids laid over the older, curvier plans. The great tradition of painted tomb chambers had thinned to a trickle, and then to almost nothing. Inscriptions in the Etruscan script grew rarer with each generation, appearing mostly on tombs and dedications, where habit and piety kept the old letters alive a little longer than daily life did. And yet, even as the political map turned entirely Roman, the ritual expertise did not vanish. The haruspices continued to be consulted, in Rome and beyond, for centuries after Etruria had ceased to be a country of its own. The bronze liver of Piacenza, that little map of the sky pressed into metal, is dated to the late 2nd or early 1st century before the Common Era, long after Veii had fallen and the old league had dissolved. The bronze survived because the knowledge survived. The knowledge survived because Rome, in absorbing Etruria, had not thrown its ritual life away. It had folded it in. It is very tempting to describe what happened to the Etruscans as a disappearance. It is more honest and gentler to describe it as an absorption. They did not vanish. They were dissolved, over centuries, into the culture that had grown up next to them, and had been shaped by them all along. When Rome swallowed Etruria, it was, in a sense, only completing a meal it had been eating for 400 years. And the old question, the one we set out with, of who the Etruscans were and what the Romans saw in them, becomes here quieter and stranger, because at some point along the way the two peoples had begun to share a shadow. Picture, for a moment, the last days of the siege of Veii on a bright autumn morning. The walls above the ravines, pale in the early light, the smoke of Roman campfires drawn in a wide arc around the plateau. Inside the city, streets that are still quiet, shrines still being tended, an old woman sweeping a threshold as she has always done, a boy carrying water, and, somewhere in the citadel, a priest lifting a knife over an animal in a room that does not yet know how the day will end. History remembers the ending. That morning did not. Picture 2. A Roman aristocrat, 3 or 4 generations later, in the 1st century before the Common Era, standing in the atrium of his house on a hill that had once been Etruscan ground. On the wall in front of him hangs a bronze mirror engraved with a scene from the old religion. Figures with wings, a name in letters he can partly sound out, and no longer really read. It has been in his family for a long time. He knows it is precious. He is no longer entirely sure what it means. And picture, out in the country, an Etruscan farmer, several generations after independence, ploughing a field near Volterra on a warm afternoon. His blade catches on something in the soil. He bends down, brushes away the earth, and lifts out a small green bronze figurine of a god. He turns it in his hand. He does not know the god's name. He does not know the prayer that was once said to it. He wraps it in a bit of cloth and takes it home and sets it on a shelf, where it will sit, quietly, for the rest of his life. The land is the same land. The sky is the same sky. The furrows he cuts run over older furrows, and older ones under those. What has thinned is not the people. What has thinned is the speech in which they once named what they saw above them and beneath them. And once you begin to lose the names of your gods, you begin to lose the language that spoke to them. One of the reasons the Etruscans feel forgotten, even though they left so much of themselves behind, in bronze and stone and painted plaster, is that their language has not yet fully come back to us. It is there, on the walls of tombs, and along the rims of cups, and across the folded surface of the bronze liver we have already touched on. It has been there waiting for more than 2,000 years. We can look at it. We can, in a strange and halfway, sound it out. And still, when we lean close to listen, most of what it wants to say slips just past the edge of understanding. The basic shape of the situation is this. More than 9,000 Etruscan inscriptions survive. They are cut into tombstones and scratched into pottery, pressed into votive offerings, left at shrines, engraved on the backs of mirrors, hammered onto bronze plaques, and written, in the case of one remarkable object, on strips of linen. This is not a whisper of evidence. It is, by the standards of ancient languages, a considerable body of text. There are peoples of the ancient Mediterranean whose speech survives in a handful of lines. The Etruscans left thousands, and the script itself is not the problem. The Etruscans borrowed their alphabet from the Greeks, most likely by way of the trading colonies along the southern Italian coast, and they adapted it to their own sounds. That alphabet is, in its bones, the ancestor of the one you are reading now. A scholar who knows the letters can move along an Etruscan inscription and pronounce it, syllable by syllable, with reasonable confidence. We know more or less how these words sounded when they were spoken. What we do not know, in the deep way that unlocks a language, is what most of them meant. The reason lies in the family tree of languages, or rather in the Etruscans' curious absence from it. Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, the old tongues of the Celts and the Germans and the Slavs, along with the modern languages you might speak or half remember, all descend from a common Indo-European root, and share, at bedrock, a great many words and grammatical bones. Etruscan does not. It sits outside that family altogether. Its closest known relative appears to be a language attested by a small handful of inscriptions on the Aegean island of Lemnos, and together with one or two other fragmentary tongues, these have been grouped, tentatively, into what scholars call the Tyrsenian or Tyrrhenian family. It is a family with very few members and very thin evidence, and much of what is said about it must be said softly. So we come to the texts themselves, without the ladder that comparison usually provides. And most of what we have is short. A great many inscriptions are the kind of thing that appears on gravestones anywhere in the world. A name, a father's name, a mother's name, an age, a title, a brief formula of farewell. From these we have learned a great deal about how Etruscan families were structured, about the words for son and daughter, for wife, for magistrate, for priest. We have a vocabulary of relationships and offices. What we do not have, in most cases, is a sentence long enough to breathe in. There are a few exceptions, and they are precious. One of them stands today in the museum at Perugia, and is called the Sippus Perusinus. It is a stone slab, roughly the height of a child, discovered in 1822 on a hillside near the old Etruscan city of Perusia, which the Romans later called Perugia, and we now call Perugia. Its faces are covered in careful lines of script, nearly 130 words in all, one of the longest continuous Etruscan texts we possess. And when scholars set to work on it, they found, gradually, that it appeared to be a legal document, a boundary agreement drawn up between two families, laying out rights to a piece of land, perhaps involving a tomb and the fields around it. We can read its letters. We can even, in places, follow its sense. But a full, confident, word-for-word translation still eludes us. It is, in a way, an entire quiet drama of Etruscan life, of neighbors and inheritances, and small parcels of earth, spoken almost, but not quite, into our hearing. The other long text has a stranger history still. It is called the Liber Linteus, the Linen Book, and it is exactly that. It was written, in Etruscan on long strips of fine linen cloth, most likely as a religious calendar or a ritual manual, laying out what was to be done, and when, and to whom. And it would almost certainly have vanished, as most linen from the ancient world has vanished, except that at some point in antiquity the cloth was cut into strips and reused as bandages for an Egyptian mummy. The mummy was purchased in the 19th century by a traveler, brought back to Europe, and eventually came to rest in the museum in Zagreb, where at some point a curator noticed that the wrappings bore writing, and that the writing was not Egyptian. It is now the longest surviving Etruscan text we have. It, too, is only partly understood. Scholars can recognize the names of gods within it, and the shapes of ritual instructions, and a rhythm of days and offerings. Much of the rest remains, for the moment, a music without a libretto. Compare all of this, for a moment, with what happened to Egyptian hieroglyphs. For centuries those signs stared out from temple walls with what looked like unshakable secrecy. And then, in 1799, a slab of dark stone was pulled from the earth at Rosetta in the Nile Delta, carrying the same decree in 3 scripts, one of them Greek. With Greek as the key, the door swung slowly open, and a whole civilization began to speak again in its own voice. For Etruscan, no such key has yet been found. There is no Rosetta Stone in the Museum of Perugia, no bilingual slab in Tarquinia or Cerveteri that lays an Etruscan text alongside a full Greek or Latin translation. And in the absence of that key, the silence has simply lasted. It is possible that such a text once existed. Some scholars believe that longer bilingual inscriptions must have been carved somewhere along the way, for treaties between Etruscan cities and their Greek or Roman neighbors, for grand dedications in cosmopolitan sanctuaries, and that these have simply not survived. Others suspect that Etruscan literary culture, whatever its scale, was more limited than the great libraries of Alexandria or Rome, and that what we have may be close to what there was. We may never know, and that not knowing is part of the atmosphere the Etruscans still cast, of a civilization we can read and cannot quite hear. Picture, if you like, a 19th-century scholar in a lamplit room in Bologna or Florence, bent over a paper squeeze taken from an Etruscan tomb. He wets the paper and presses it into the inscription and lifts away a soft, reversed impression of every stroke. Back at his desk, by the yellow light of an oil lamp, he traces the letters one by one and sounds them aloud, and hears, in his own voice, syllables that no living person has spoken as a mother tongue for perhaps 2,000 years. He can pronounce them, he cannot answer them. Picture, too, the workshop in Zagreb in the late 19th century, and the linen strips of the mummy being unwound with great care and laid out, one after another, on a long table, so that the inked script upon them could be seen together for the first time in centuries. The lines are neat, the hand is careful. Somewhere in that ordered writing is a set of instructions for the proper honoring of gods, whose names we can only partly recover. And picture, today, the Sippus Perusinus in its quiet room in the museum at Perugia, standing behind glass, its lines of script running down its faces in patient columns, and the visitors leaning in close to look at them. They do not know what the stone says. They know that it says something. And, without quite deciding to, they lower their voices, as one does in the presence of a sleeping guest, or of an old letter one has not yet worked out how to read. But if their language has kept some of its meaning to itself, the Etruscans left a fuller record of one thing above all others, which is how they read the sky. The Etruscans, more than any other people of ancient Italy, treated the sky as a text, not as a decoration above the world, and not as a blank field crossed by weather, but as something written, and therefore something that could, with patience and training, be read. To lift one's eyes at dusk, in an Etruscan city, was not to look at empty air. It was to look at a page. We have already met, in passing, the 16 regions marked out on the bronze model of the liver found near Piacenza. Those same 16 regions belonged, first of all, to the sky itself. The Etruscans divided the dome above them into 16 segments, 8 to the east and 8 to the west, and drew a further line running from north to south, so that the whole hemisphere became a kind of grid. Each segment belonged to particular gods. Each direction carried its own weight of meaning. The east, where the sun rose, tended toward favor. The northwest, behind the observer's left shoulder as he faced the south, tended toward the darker powers. A bird crossing the sky from one region into another was not simply a bird. It was a sentence in the process of being spoken. The ritual specialists who read these sentences were trained, by tradition, for many years. Their apprenticeship was long and quiet, passed within families and priestly lineages, and it covered a wider field than any one image can capture. They read the livers of sacrificed animals, yes, but they also read the flight of birds, noting the direction of approach and the direction of departure, the height, the number, the species. They read the lightning, which was a subject of extraordinary refinement. A bolt seen in one region of the sky meant one thing. A bolt seen in another region, or thrown by a different god, meant something entirely different and had to be answered with a different rite. And they read the small, strange interruptions of the ordinary world, the ones that seem to us today like mere coincidence. The birth of a two-headed calf, an unseasonal storm out of a clear month, a tree split open in still weather. Each of these was treated as a word that had been placed in the world on purpose, and each required a considered reply. The Romans, writing later about all of this, gave the whole body of knowledge a name. They called it the Etrusca Disciplina, the Etruscan teaching, and they described it as running along three great strands. There were the Librae Haruspicini, the books of liver reading, in which the interpretation of the entrails was set out region by region and organ by organ. There were the Librae Fulgurales, the books of lightning, in which each part of the sky and each type of bolt was matched to its meaning and its answering ritual. And there were the Libri Rituales, the books of ritual, which were the broadest of the three, covering the proper conduct of ceremonies, the calendar of festivals, and most striking of all to a Roman reader, the correct way to found a city. For the Libri Rituales, as later writers described them, contained detailed instructions for the moment when a new city was first drawn on the ground. The founder, following the teaching, was to yoke a white ox and a white cow to a bronze plough, and to draw a furrow along the line of the future walls. That furrow was the pomerium, the sacred boundary. At each place where a gate was to stand, the ploughman was to lift the plough clear of the earth and carry it across, so that the line was complete in principle, but broken in practice, so that traffic and trade and armies could pass through without violating the boundary itself. The streets within were to be oriented in accordance with the same divided sky that the augurs read overhead. The gates were to be placed where the reading of the heavens allowed. And it seems, from a great deal of later evidence, that Roman city founding itself inherited many of these elements, so that the very shape of Roman towns across the Mediterranean carried, somewhere beneath the surface, an Etruscan grammar. There is one further teaching within the Etrusca Disciplina that is worth pausing over, gently, because it has an atmosphere all its own. Later Roman writers reported that the Etruscans held a doctrine about the ages of the world. History, in this teaching, was not an open, endless road. It was divided into a fixed number of secula, each of a fixed span, and each people had been granted a certain number of these ages at the beginning of their existence. When the last seculum ran out, that people's history would end. It is possible that the Etruscans themselves taught this, in something close to the form the Romans described. It is also possible that later writers, looking back at a civilization already fading around them, projected onto the Etruscans a tidiness the Etruscans would not have recognized. We may never know. The teaching survives mainly through Roman voices, and Roman voices had their own reasons for arranging the past into neat, completed shapes. But it is, whatever its true origin, a very Etruscan-feeling idea. A people who read the sky as a divided book, and who read the liver as a divided map, would perhaps also read time itself as a book with a last page already written. There is something calm in that thought, something almost restful, as if the Etruscans, or at any rate the Etruscans as later Romans remembered them, had decided long in advance not to be surprised when their turn came. Not to rage against it, only to notice, when the signs began to gather, that the reading was drawing to its close. Picture for a moment an augur standing on a low hilltop at dawn, in the cool blue-grey light before the sun clears the eastern hills. He has drawn, with a wooden staff, an imagined line across the sky, quartering it into its regions, and he stands within the quartered space, waiting. He does not summon a bird. He waits for one. Any bird of any kind, entering the frame from any direction, will speak. He has only to be still enough and attentive enough to hear it. Picture, elsewhere, the ceremony of a city being drawn out of empty ground, the white ox and the white cow, patient at the yoke, the bronze ploughshare turning up a thin, damp line of soil along the future wall, the ploughman lifting the whole apparatus at each gate and setting it down again beyond, the onlookers watching in near silence, because it is understood that what is being cut into the earth is not just a boundary, but a promise, and that the promise is being made to gods whose houses are marked out overhead in the same divided sky. And picture, in the last century before Etruria was fully absorbed, a priest of the old teaching sitting in a small stone chamber by lamplight, writing on strips of fine linen. He is copying patiently the rites entrusted to his house. He does not know that the linen he writes upon will, by a long chain of accidents no one could foresee, one day be cut into strips and wrapped around a body in Egypt, and then unwound in a museum in Zagreb, so that his careful lines can be laid out and photographed and puzzled over by strangers. He knows only that the words are worth copying, and that the sky above his roof is still divided into houses, and that the reading, for now, continues. By the time the last Etruscan cities were folded quietly into the Roman world, the disciplina did not vanish. It went with them, in the persons of the specialists who were kept on, and in the books that were consulted at Rome in moments of unease, and in the shape of the streets and gates of towns whose citizens no longer remembered why the plough had been lifted just there. The sky above Italy was still divided. The line still ran from north to south. The bolts still fell into their regions. Only the language for naming what they meant was slowly being forgotten, in favor of a Latin that had learned the gestures without always keeping the grammar. All of which brings us slowly to the deepest part of tonight's walk. To the question of what the Romans, in the presence of these quiet neighbors and their divided sky and their books of ages, were really afraid of, which was never, in the end, an army. Because if you have followed the long path this far, through the painted rooms and the ridge of furnace smoke and the 16 quarters of the sky, you have already seen, without my needing to say it, that the word in the title of tonight's walk is doing something quiet. It is doing more work than it looks like it is doing, and less. It is not the word a soldier would use. It is not the word a general reporting from a campaign would send back to the Senate. It is a softer word than that, and an older one, and it belongs less to the battlefield than to the lamplit study where a man reads something in a language he half remembers, and sets the scroll down and looks for a long moment at the wall. Recall, softly, what we have already walked through. The painted rooms beneath the ridge, with their dancers and their long tables. The city of the dead, laid out in tumuli along its quiet lanes. The coast where the furnaces burned all night, and the ore came across from the island in flat-bottomed boats. The bronze model of a sheep's liver, its upper surface divided into small labelled fields. These are not on their face the possessions of a people to be feared. They are the possessions of a people to be studied and admired and quietly imitated. And on the surface, the Romans were not afraid of the Etruscans in any ordinary sense. They fought them, and they won. They took their cities one by one over the long, slow centuries after the fall of Veii. They absorbed their aristocracy into the Roman order, and married into their families, and served in office beside them, and inherited their houses. They ate the food that had been eaten in Etruria, and drank the wine that had been made there. And in time they forgot the language that had been spoken there, until only priests and antiquarians could still work through a line of it with any confidence. On every scale a conqueror uses to measure a victory, Rome had won. And yet, underneath all of that, something in the Roman mind stayed uneasy, something the Roman writers keep circling in tones they do not use for anyone else. Because the Etruscans could read the sky, and Rome could not. The Etruscans had a system of divine meaning that predated Rome's own, and was more elaborate and more self-consistent, and had been in practice long before anyone in Rome could have told you the name of the first king. When a lightning bolt struck a Roman temple, or a strange creature was born in a Roman field, or a flame appeared where no flame ought to have been, Rome had to send, quietly, for an Etruscan specialist to explain what the gods had said. And no matter how large Rome grew, no matter how many legions it commanded, no matter how far its roads and aqueducts and letters of appointment stretched, that dependency did not go away. Rome could conquer land, Rome could not, quite, conquer meaning. And there is a particular kind of unease that settles over a power when it understands, in some half-articulated way, that the frame through which it interprets its own good fortune was drawn up by somebody else. Cicero, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, treats the haruspices with the peculiar tone of a man discussing a foreign expertise he cannot afford to dismiss, and cannot quite endorse. He is respectful and skeptical, and a little wary, and all three at once, and the tone does not resolve. It is the tone of a man who knows that the last time the Senate acted against the advice of an Etruscan reader, something unfortunate followed, and knows also that he cannot say quite why. That tone, sustained across centuries of Roman prose, is the real trace of the word in tonight's title. Not terror in the loud sense, not the fear of an approaching army. Something quieter. The unease of the borrower who suspects that the thing he has borrowed is older, deeper, and more coherent than he ever quite understood. Note also, very gently, the age question. When Rome was still a scatter of huts on a hill above the Tiber, the Etruscans were already burying their aristocrats in painted rooms cut into the rock. When Rome had not yet named its first king, the priests of Etruria were already dividing the sky into houses, and reading the passage of birds across those houses, and marking the falling of bolts into their assigned regions. Rome grew up next door to a civilization that had already grown up. And there is a particular kind of unease that comes from being, permanently, the younger power in your own memory, the child at the table who has learned the manners of the house without being told when the house was built. That is the shape, I think, of what the Roman writers keep almost saying. Whether the old story of a migration from Lydia is right, or the old counter-argument that the people were always there, does not really change it. Either way, they were older. Either way, when Rome looked at them, it was looking at something that had been in place first. And so the question we have been walking around all this time, the question of what the Romans saw in the Etruscans and could not quite name, is a question we are not going to close tonight, because I do not think it can be closed. The Romans themselves could not close it. They inherited the ritual, and they kept the ritual, and they conquered the people who had made the ritual, and still, when a bolt of lightning struck the wrong temple in the wrong quarter of the sky, they sent for a man from Etruria. That, I think, is the answer, or the shape of an answer. That fear, in the deep sense, is what the borrower feels toward the lender who no longer answers the door. Picture, then, a Roman senator, late at night in the 1st century before the Common Era, sitting up by the light of a single lamp with an old inscription copied out on a slip of parchment in front of him. He reads Latin easily and Greek without much trouble, and he can pick his way through the odd Punic phrase if he has to. This other language, though, he cannot fully translate. He can catch a name, and the shape of a dedication, and the sense of an office being held, but the grammar slides away from him at the joints. Above his head, the ceiling beams rest on a foundation laid by an Etruscan mason 3 centuries earlier. He does not think of the mason. He thinks only that the words are worth copying, in case one day someone will know what they meant. Picture, at the same moment, the bronze liver back in the country north of the Apennines, or rather, what will one day be Piacenza. It has already been lost, perhaps, into the soil of a field, where it will lie for 2,000 years before a ploughshare turns it up. Under museum light, much later, the 16 regions on its upper surface will still be faintly legible, still doing quietly whatever they were made to do, a small map of a sky that has not, in truth, been unmade. And picture, last of all, the traveller from the very first scene of tonight's walk, still on his ridge above the valley, still watching the torchlit settlement and the torchlit stones circle in the mist below. He has stood there, in our imagining, through every chapter. He has seen the tombs, and the furnaces, and the priest at his linen, and the plough lifted at the gate. He understands now, in a way he could not have said before, that he cannot go down. Not because he is unwelcome, but because the language spoken down there, the language in which the sky is a text, and the liver is a map and a boundary is a promise, is not one he has ever learned, and is not one that will wait for him to learn it. The lamps in the valley burn on without needing him. The stone circle keeps its quiet hours. The wind moves once through the pines, and settles again, and that, more or less, is where we let the question rest. Not answered, just held, for a while in the quiet. The Etruscans are more than 2,000 years gone now. The furnaces along the Iron Coast are quiet. The great domed tombs at Cerveteria grass. The painted banqueters beneath Tarquinia are still lifting their cups in the dark, but no one has poured them anything in a very long time. The kings of Rome are a story. The republic that followed is a story. The empire that grew out of the republic is a story. All of it is far away from your warm bed and your quiet room tonight. The traveller on the ridge in his dark cloak, if he was ever there at all, has long since gone home. The torches in the valley have gone out. The mist has settled for the last time. The 16 quarters of the sky are still there, above wherever you are lying, but no one is reading them tonight, and that is all right. You do not have to hold on to any of it. You do not have to remember which king built the great sewer, or which city fell in which year, or which tomb had the leopards painted on its walls. Most of the names, in the deepest sense, are not fully known even to the scholars who spend their lives with them. The people who lived those lives did not need us to remember them, and they will not mind if the details slip away from you now. You can let the whole quiet civilization drift down to the bottom of your mind and settle there, the way silt settles in a slow river. There is no need to keep watching the screen. You can close your eyes. Sleep is not failure here. Sleep is the point. If you have already been asleep for an hour, that is exactly right. If your eyes are only just beginning to grow heavy, that is also right. There is nothing else to do tonight. If it helps, imagine a small bell being rung, very quietly, once, in a room a long way away. That is all. Nothing to answer, nothing to attend to. The Etruscans read the sky. The Romans borrowed the reading. The centuries turned, as centuries do, without asking permission of anyone. And somewhere in the hills of Tuscany tonight, the tombs are still there, and the tumuli are still there. And the painted banqueters are still lifting their cups in the dark, and the mist is still doing the slow, patient thing that mist does in a valley in Italy at the end of a long day. The traveller on his ridge is only a shape in the imagination now, and the stone circle below him keeps its quiet hours without him. Like everything in this story, they are still there, and untroubled by whether we understand them. Good night, from wherever this finds you. Sleep well.